All right, Dr. Sabi, I think that may be our clue that we are going to get going. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I'm Maria Alonso, and I have the pleasure today of introducing our wonderful presenter. Dr. Sevier received her bachelor degree from University of Pennsylvania. She went on to receive her medical degree from Wake Forest University School of Medicine. She completed her residency in radiation oncology at the University of Pittsburgh and University of Tennessee Health Science Center. Dr. Xavier is board certified in radiation oncology by the American Board of Radiology and a member of several professional organizations, including American Society of Therapeutic Radiology and Oncology, American Society of Clinical Oncology, American Medical Association, and Albert Schweitzer Fellows for Life. Her specialty skills and interests include stereotactic radiosurgery, stereotactic body radiation therapy, intensity modulated radiation therapy, brachytherapy, intraoperative breast radiotherapy, and survivorship. She is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for the Department of Radiation Oncology and also serves as a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Cabinet member for the University of Kansas School of Medicine. Thank you so much for being here. We're very excited to have you, and yeah, welcome.
Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. All right, so I'd like to say a huge thanks for the opportunity to present today and connect with you all. It's an honor to meet with others who are active in this space. Before I dive into this topic, I wanted to add a little bit. DEI is a huge interest of mine, personal interest and a passion of mine. During my medical training, I encountered some strong personalities in medicine, and imagine that. And I saw examples of what I wanted to become and what I didn't want to become. And I'm determined to change the culture of medicine for the next generation. And most importantly, I think we have a lot of work to do in terms of making our culture more inclusive for all patients in our care. As you can see, I'm Asian, I'm Korean American, and I happen to be married to a culturally Jewish guy with roots to Switzerland and Russia. So he's from an immigrant family too, and we have some interesting conversations at home. Anyway, so today I'd like to discuss how to mitigate your biases during interviews. This is a similar presentation to what I gave to my department leaders last fall in the beginning of the medical residency recruiting season. And it's interesting, radiation oncology goes through waves of popularity. And right now we're experiencing an interesting time where we really had to take a step back, see what's going on, see how we got here, assess where we're going to go and how to get there. And it was a great opportunity for us to really just check ourselves in terms of how we stack up in terms of DEI. And to me, DEI and recruiting go hand in hand. And I'm really proud of how my colleagues really revamped our efforts and the conversations that we're having now. I couldn't be more proud of what we're discussing. So we've come a long way. And so I thought this might be something that might be applicable to more than just our department and for any of us who are in a position to interview for jobs within KU. And I just wanted to share what we've been learning. So hopefully this is helpful in facilitating productive conversations. So let me just go ahead and start sharing my screen here. Okay, so and I am just for a second. Okay, I'm just gonna mute my camera so I'm not distracting anybody, but here we go. So, are you seeing my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, all right, so So anyway, so let's get started. This is an outline of my talk. So why? And just a quick reminder of what we're talking about in terms of inclusion, racism, and implications in relation to interviewing and recruiting, how unconscious bias comes into play, and all the things that come with that, ways that we can mitigate our biases during interviews, what inclusive recruitment looks like, interviewing best practices, common rating errors, and then obviously do's and don'ts when it comes to interviews and evaluations. Okay, so why? So what does diversity, equity, inclusion have to do with interviews? Diversity in healthcare workforce is critical for many reasons. First, we want to promote more culturally responsive care. We want to improve access to high quality healthcare for underserved populations. We want to broaden research agendas, and we want to eliminate healthcare disparities. Just a quick reminder of what inclusion means to all of you. I'm sure you already know, but when we say inclusion, we want the person to feel like an insider. So we want to be in this box, right? So we want the person to feel like an insider. So you have a high sense of belonging and to feel valued for the unique traits and experiences that person brings to the table. So racism and implications in relation to interviews. As Kaiser Soze says, a character out of one of my favorite movies of all time, The Usual Suspects, the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince the world that he didn't exist. That's exactly true for racism. So many of us, including myself, consider ourselves progressive, open-minded, well-meaning, forward-thinking people, and we would adamantly deny being a racist. But how can we truly say that if we're free from any sort of, if we're not free from any sort of bias we have about certain people? Through mainstream media, we are constantly bombarded with reinforced stereotypes, and there's nothing out there that properly educates us. And the way that we're taught about racism makes it impossible to fully understand it or completely be bias-free, right? So there is an article that profoundly challenged everything I knew about recruiting and interviews, and I highly recommend that you reference this. It's called Interviewed While Black. It's written by Dr. Josh Ellis. And I'm going to read an excerpt from it because I think it's really helpful. So he says, from his experience, this is what he encountered. Inside a conference room with a long wooden table, a Black residency applicant sat next to 12 other applicants on the interview day. None of the peers were Black. Across the table hung photos of faculty members, including program director, medical director, and department chair. None were Black. In the corner of the room, administrators and coordinators were monitoring the agenda. None were Black. Rosters with descriptions and headshots of faculty interviewers were distributed. None were Black. Later, residents spoke to applicants over lunch, and nurses sat at the workstations during the tour. None were Black. During the course of the day, the Black applicant was asked whether they were lost and twice assumed to be anyone but an applicant. They were told that they had an unusual name and they were articulate. Their hair was critiqued. And at the end of the interview, the Black applicant wondered, do I fit in here? If you were the Black applicant described in this paragraph that I just read, how well would you perform on this interview day? How comfortable would you feel? So as we all know, anytime you interview, it's a concrete opportunity to determine compatibility between the applicant and the program. But there is substantial explicit and implicit bias just on the interview day that favors the white candidate. Here is a list of relevant concepts that a member of the underrepresented minority in medicine can experience during this day. For each concept, this author gives verbal examples, nonverbal examples, and the implication. So, microaggression. A faculty member asks a Black applicant, did you play any sports in college? After seeing that the applicant attended an Ivy League university. Nonverbal example, despite the Black applicant repeatedly being the first applicant to raise their hand, other applicants were called on first to ask questions each time. The implication is that the applicant feels that academic potential has been invalidated and dismissed. The second concept is stereotype threat. Verbal example is when an interviewer mentions affirmative action facilitates recruitment of faculty from groups that are underrepresented in minority and in medicine. The Black applicant struggles to promote their own accomplishments. Nonverbal example, during a slideshow, photographs of Black faculty members are featured only on diversity and inclusion page. The Black applicant now feels less comfortable discussing interest in technology. The implication is that the Black applicant recognizes stereotypes portrayed, reliance on affirmative action, interest in diversity and inclusion. This causes the applicant to perform less during the interview day. Tokenism. During an interview, the faculty member states, "We are specifically looking for diversity. We don't want our team just to be just a bunch of white males." Nonverbal example is that the Black applicant is given pamphlets about diversity and inclusion office in the interview day folders. Other applicants don't receive the same information. The implication is that the Black applicant is made to feel like a metric instead of a colleague. Imposter syndrome. The interviewer inadvertently mentions the accomplishments of other applicant who is in fact just as qualified as the Black applicant. The Black applicant immediately feels as if they don't belong. A successful Black applicant grows nervous looking at the awards and certificates hanging on the interviewer's office. The competitive Black applicant doubts their qualifications for the interview or the opportunity, and subsequently the applicant comes off as nervous and insecure during their interview. Homophily. During an interview, the applicant comments and connects on similar hobbies and lived experiences that the Black applicant does not share. During the interview lunch, the Black applicant notices that the white faculty spends more time with the white applicants. The two Black applicants are eating together. The implication is that the Black applicant anticipates a potential barrier to socializing with others in the program if they happen to go there. And that's huge, right? So how does our unconscious bias affect interviews? There is overwhelming scientific evidence that unconscious bias affects evaluation and selection of candidates for leadership positions in all types of organizations, including medical schools and residency programs. We all know what unconscious bias is. I'm not going to define it. It's pervasive. We all have it. It predicts our nonverbal behavior the most. Our verbal communication is tightly controlled by norms and fear of looking bad. There's compelling body of scientific evidence that shows that unconscious bias affects selection, hiring, leadership selection, and daily interactions. A good measuring tool that's commonly used is the IAT test, implicit association test. It tested about 10 million people, and it basically shows that although we may be conscious of it or endorse it, but greater than 75% of people from all backgrounds associate good with white, males with science and career, females with liberal arts, and family. So most people tend to prefer white, young men and physically able. So unconscious bias affects evaluation in terms of letters of recommendation. Letters of recommendation written for women are shorter, less focused on accomplishment, and twice as more likely to have gender terms and less professional respect. So they would say things like smart young lady or insightful woman. It uses less standout adjectives such as excellent, superb, outstanding, unique, a lot less than men, letters of recommendation for men. There's higher use of grindstone adjectives like hardworking, conscientious, dedicated, meticulous, 34% in women versus 23% in men, meaning that the success for the woman is due to the effort versus men, it's just pure talent and ability. There's higher use of doubt raisers, negative language, hedges, unexplained comments in women versus men. There's higher reference to personal life for women versus men. There's lower incidence of multiple mentions of research in women versus men. There's lower reference to accomplishments in women versus men. There's lower reference to publications and lower use of the word successful in women versus men. So even when you're actually asked to write letters of recommendation, please just check yourself. In the proportion of candidate pool, there is an interesting fact that when the proportion of women being considered in an applicant pool is less than 25%, then the women being interviewed were evaluated as unqualified or for the position and not recommended for hire. So that shows you that in addition to our own unconscious bias and biases that we all hold, there could be situational factors and circumstances that make this even worse. So this is a very important thing to look for whenever you're interviewing a group of people. Please make sure that you have at least 25% of the pool being women, if you can. Unconscious bias and hiring. In the past, orchestra auditions were handpicked by music directors through auditions sometimes held in their living rooms. Starting in 1970s, a new policy of blind auditions began, and suddenly there was a lot more women being advanced to the next round of auditions, and women's chances were increased by 50%. There's also another study that looked at hiring a Karen versus a Brian. So real CVs were changed where the names were changed to a Brian Miller or a Karen Miller. And not surprisingly, the evaluators were much more likely to recommend and hire a Brian Miller than the women Karen Miller. They were 4 times more likely to include comments about details from their CV than the Karen Miller, and tenure levels were granted more to Brian than Karen. Interesting also, another study looked at Emily versus Lakeisha, or Greg versus Jamal. Obviously, you can kind of tell the background of the people who are being interviewed with those names. And so, not surprisingly, CVs with white sounding names were 50% more likely to receive a callback or go to the next round than black sounding names. Employers who even said we're an equal opportunity employer on their website and ads, they didn't perform any differently. There's also something called the parent trap, where experiment of 2 applicants with the same qualifications but different parent status. You can kind of imagine what happened. Mothers were 43% less likely to be recommended for hire than non-mothers. Mothers were rated as less competent, less promotable, and less likely to be recommended for management. They started at a lot lower salaries. So how does unconscious bias also affect leadership? Women are seen as less interested in leadership roles, which may or may not be true. Women were less likely to be asked to be committee chairs, section head, department head, or involved in other decision-making spaces. There's also a double standard of women being stereotyped as communal, nurturing, supportive, and sympathetic. And it's incongruent to how we expect women to behave and how we expect leaders to behave, in that we want decisive, strong, independent risk takers. And women were deemed as less likely to be doing that. So women are required to meet higher standards to be in leadership. So there are some strategies of, how do I get rid of this? Okay. There are some strategies to mitigate your bias. First, deepen your pool. Work really hard to get the proportion of women that you're considering to be at least 25% of the candidate pool to lessen that statistical bias, right? You want to start recruiting before you have a need by identifying, getting to know the promising individuals at conferences or publications. Use gender neutral titles like chair, not chairman. Be aware of how minimum qualifications may disproportionately advantage certain groups. Send faculty venues to target women and minorities at special sessions, at conferences and events, and network. Connect with organizations for women and minorities within your specialty. Ask colleagues for leads. Don't necessarily put a lot of weight in letters of recommendation based on what we just talked about. And there are also things that you can do as an individual to lessen your bias. Be hyper aware of your own biases, and know that that definitely comes into play, even though you're not aware of it. You have to accept that there are unfair treatment practices that have been around for a long time and that need to be corrected. You need to be educated and be aware of the challenges faced by those who are not represented well in medicine. And there are a couple of psychological studies that gave me the greatest hope for humanity. These 2 studies that I'm referencing here, they basically say that all the stereotypes and biases that you have in you can be changed now and even later. So a big shout out to Dr. Marcus Alt, who is one of my favorite colleagues. He gave me access to these primary articles that basically say that your mental imaging, the way you imagine something in your mind's eye, can really change what stereotypes you hold. Just for the sake of time, I won't go into it in detail, but this is super important. So in one of the experiments, they did 5 experiments. We're talking about Blair et al. Article, but they did 5 experiments that basically showed that all the biases that you have is changeable. So what they did is they had participants take an IAT test to see what their biases are. And then they showed them images of something that goes against that stereotype. So, you know, they showed them pictures of women being strong and all the things that you associate with women, not as that. So they showed them these images and they say, imagine what a strong woman is like. Well, why is she considered strong? What is she capable of doing? What kinds of things does she enjoy? Versus just neutral images. And afterwards, they were asked to write a paragraph about that. And then they took an IAT test afterwards, and their biases were changed based on this experience. So this gives me so much hope because even in an interview setting, if you are interviewing somebody you don't have a lot of experience in making connections or having conversations with people from that group, you can have mental images that can counteract what you know is in you. And so you can be intentional about your actions, and that can really change the outcome of your connection, right? So anyway, so this is, I think, really powerful and important. Back to this. Okay, so there are also things that you can do at an institutional level to change how you interview, right? So look at the job description, remove languages that can cause gender priming to attract men only, use a specific agreed upon standard scoring rubric. You can have careful and fair recruitment of diverse interviewers to create a welcoming environment to have the maximum representation. You can have a clearly defined criteria and selection and evaluation. You can also agree on the types of questions to be asked. You also want to allow for sufficient time because under pressure, your biases come out more. And you have to think about intentionally whom to not exclude. When you intentionally avoid making excuses to eliminate a candidate, you get a better outcome. Also, it's important to get training and have conversations like this to talk about ways that we can mitigate biases, obviously. And then you can create accountability for the decision makers to improve the outcome, right? So the department leader should be clearly involved and held accountable for that. So what does inclusive recruitment look like? It's interesting, in our department, we went from looking for the perfect, outstanding, looks perfect on paper kind of candidates to really taking that person's entire background and that person as a whole into consideration. So individualizing the process and being flexible with what we're looking for. And those are all good things. We're looking for things like, you know, their hometown, their educational background. I mean, difficult things that they've had to encounter where they had to overcome something. You're looking for like grit, resilience, their ability to work well with other people. And this is, I think, much more important than somebody with perfect numbers and the perfect letters of recommendation from people who are in, you know, high up there. So, and this is something that we really had to come to grips with and to really embrace in our department. And I think it's been a really good exercise. So in general, standardized tests are meant to provide a certain I guess, bare minimum. but you have to keep in mind that it even further causes disadvantage in people who are already not represented in medicine. For example, there's a 10 to 20% a point differential for Black versus white test takers in this typical board exams that we take. The average underrepresented in medicine and female students perform below their counterparts on standardized tests and at the end of rotation standardized tests. Clinical performance ratings are very subjective, a very subjective bias. There are also racial disparities in introduction to the honor society or the AOA society. So we have to kind of keep that in mind when we're evaluating candidates. And I think this causes us to kind of stop looking at certain things just for efficiency and to really evaluate the person as a whole. And I think that's a really good step forward. Other recruitment ideas to make it more inclusive, have one person review every applicant from the same program or school for the interview selection so that you're not introducing more bias. Some people say blinding interviewers to typical metrics like board exam scores and whatnot. Studies have shown that there's less implicit bias from residents, younger faculty, women, and underrepresented minorities. And then, prioritizing this kind of conversation and training all year round, not just during recruiting season, right? So there are also some interviewing best practices. So research shows that behavioral questions primarily measure experiences and some personality traits, while situational questions may measure job knowledge. Both types have been proven to be reliable and valid predictors of future job performance, but behavioral questions have slightly higher validity. So for example, you can say, oh, tell me about a time when you encountered a difficult ethical question where you had to take a stand that might not have been popular. How did you handle that? What was the outcome? And what did you learn from that? So I like to ask those kinds of questions because it really helps me to understand who that person is beyond a number, right? And then there is also an acronym called STAR, where we look at the situation or task, action, and result. So describe the context, behavior or action taken, and then outcomes or consequences as a result. And then just be careful. Yes, you want to ask open-ended probing questions, but you want to kind of have a fine balance, right? So if you ask too many, then it can kind of cue what you're looking for and lead the applicant to give you like a false response because they kind of know what you want to hear, right? But you do want to give an opportunity to explain beyond just a quick yes or no, right? So there are some common rating errors. So as an evaluator, there's something called a halo or horns effect. So rating one response to influence the rating of another response. There's something called central tendency where ratings of all applicants are kind of in the middle of the rating scale. So there are some evaluators who kind of tend to do that, but you really do want to use the entire range. So it's kind of a balance, right? And then there's also leniency or severity, giving high or low to all applicants, irrespective of their response. There's something called a contrast effects, where comparing one applicant with the performance of the previously interviewed applicant, and the order of the interviews can really affect the ratings. And that's really not fair to the applicant, right? There are some do's and don'ts. I think it's always fair and polite to ask, how do you pronounce your name? And then use that during the conversation so they can feel like you're listening and they can feel a little bit more comfortable. Obviously show genuine sincerity and enthusiasm. Find something you share in common. Ask situational, behavioral, general open-ended questions. And then listen well enough to ask insightful questions. I think that is huge. There's someone in my department who does that for almost everything that we do. And so it's really interesting that when he asks questions, he was listening because he points out exactly what the issue was and then kind of spits it right back out to you. So you can tell that he's thinking with you. That's a really good skill, I think, that you can demonstrate in the conversation. And then you also don't really want to give the feedback during the interview. it might make them more nervous or anxious. You don't want to be judgmental or ask leading questions as well. And then for the evaluation itself, you want to stay objective. You want to focus on facts, not opinions. You want to focus on the actual response. And you want to focus on one question or dimension at a time. And you want to avoid comparing applicants to one applicant to another. Try not to fill in the blanks based on your interpretation. And then you should stick to the agreed upon score or a scoring rubric or like metric, as opposed to things like, oh, we got along really well, or we have really good chemistry or something like that. And then, you know, typical no-fly zone kind of things in your department, you know, these are the typical things that I'm sure most departments have that you really don't want to ask them about, you know, plans for family or, you know, things like that, but that's common. So a few things, I wanted to leave time so that if there are questions, we can actually have a conversation and chat, because I would love to learn what you all are doing. But if you take nothing away from this talk, I would say, please remember this. So be hyper aware of your own biases when you're interviewing someone. Visualize positive images that counter your own negative stereotypes to weaken your own implicit bias and stereotypes during your interview. And then have at least 25% of the candidate pool be comprised of women in interviews as much as possible. And then please consider that a candidate's background, experiences, attributes, and personal accomplishments, in addition to the traditional academic metrics. And then some parting words. Imagine yourself as the candidate, one of the most important next steps in your life during a pandemic, right? And they're coming to interview. And based on the paragraph that I read, you know, if the person is asking themselves this question during the entire day, do I fit in here? And you want them to feel included. You want them to feel seen for who they are. And I think the way you design the interview day and encounters and everything surrounding that day can really make or break their ability to answer this question in a good way, right? So just some things to think about, and here are the references. So I think there are some questions. Okay. Does anybody have questions or would want to chime in? And
thank you so much for this. It was easy for me to like hold on to what you were saying, the way you presented. I'm just curious when you became interested in this topic and this field, Dr. Savios. And can you say your last name again? I apologize, Dr. Savios.
The Z is silent. It's Savio.
Savio.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's okay.
Apologies.
It's a Swiss French name that I had to get used to. But anyway, yeah. So thanks for asking that question. I'm a late bloomer, definitely. I didn't really consider myself a person of color until really late in life, and until I had some difficult situations during my training. And like I said, I witnessed and experienced things that I don't ever want the next generation to see in medicine. And it was really humbling, but I think it also fueled my desire to not have anyone ever feel that way. And so 3 years ago, when I took this position, Dr. Sue asked me if I'd be interested in doing this as part of my directorship in addition to my clinical responsibilities. And I said, oh my goodness, yes. So it's been an amazing experience, because every time I give a presentation to my department, it forces me to learn about things that I didn't know before. And it's interesting because every time I learn something, it makes me cringe about what I used to think. But it just goes to show you, gosh, like we're all still learning. And it's been wonderful to have the opportunity to learn and to share and to connect. But I think there are a lot of us in KU who are doing these kind of things. And I would love to connect more with others. I feel like I'm always so excited when there are other people who care about this as much as I do. And it's been kind of difficult because all of us kind of work in silo, and I work in Overland Park, and yes, I go to the main campus, but I don't go there nearly as much as I'd like to. And so I would love to connect with other people and in this space. And it's been kind of a challenge.
Well, thank you, Dr. Savio, for saying what you did as far as how the learning is a constant process. And that I too, I can relate to what you said, that sometimes I cringe at like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that I said that. And when I said that, I thought I knew so much.
Right, right.
And then we get to a point, kind of like with culture, where it's like, you realize, I just realized how much I don't know. That's like what I'm constantly just amazed at, is what I don't know. And I don't feel like I have much of a grasp on anything. So thank you for driving home that point. That's really important for us all to hear as we're trying to learn. I think that's just so supportive. And just one more comment, and I'll pass it off to Maria then, is I think you found your people, like connecting, to clinical culture and diversity through DEI. I'm hoping you'll find a lot of great connections and people who are interested in the same work as you.
Yeah, I would love to work with everybody and to connect and to collaborate. So feel free to send me an email or anything. It's interesting because I'm 46 years old, and I'm very involved in recruiting of my department, and I was interacting with a resident who's about to graduate, and she actually signed on to come to KU, and we're really excited to have her. And she happens to be 28 years young, and we were just chatting, and the topic of DEI came up, and I thought, oh my goodness, she's already like 30 steps ahead of me, and that's a part of her natural like lingo and thoughts. And I thought, oh my goodness, the education has really changed. And when I was going through medical school, we didn't talk about any of this. And I'm kind of jealous that the younger generation are so well ahead of the curve and well versed and even knowing so much more than I do. And so I'm glad that that's happening, and I would love to see more of that.
Well, oh, sorry. Did you have a question? Anyway, just off of that, I'm a medical student, so I know that I'm not really one of the intended audience here. I just am really interested in this topic, and so I think that I've always been interested in implicit bias ever since I've heard about the IIT test and implicit bias in medicine. And I think that these practices can even help me, because I hold leadership positions within the student organizations, and we have to interview every year. And I feel like it's really difficult to get diversity in those organizations as well. So I really appreciated all those practices, because I feel like, the earlier that people feel like they fit into organizations, I think the easier it will be to feel that way in the future.
So when you say you have these practices, is that like practicing with patients, or is that with future?
Well, we have student interest groups at the school,
right?
But then in addition to that, I, for one, am one of the directors of one of the specialty nights at our JDoc student-run free clinic.
Uh-huh.
And we do recruitment for those director positions every year. And I know that diversity is factored into, they're trying to make it a more diverse group that's in charge of these specialty nights, especially because the patient population that we work with is so diverse. So I think that it's just important to keep these things in mind. I think a lot of times people, when the experiences that they talk about on their applications, it's important to take into account the resources they might have had, or the access to certain types of experiences that some people have and others don't.
Right.
And then mitigating like trying to balance those factors and deciding who's the best applicant.
Right, right. And believe me, like we as a department, we are revamping our entire way of thinking. And I'm so glad you're joining. I love meeting medical students and like, yay, next generation, like you are our future, right? So I think that's awesome. I love connecting with you guys. But it's interesting because before Radonk, we used to say, oh, only 240, we're looking for 260 on like step scores. And that's all going away anyway. But now the conversation is really different. And it makes me so proud because I think, wow, you guys were actually listening when I was jabbing on and on my presentation, because we had somebody who had perfect everything and he was slightly obnoxious. And at the end of the discussion, somebody said, okay, I'm just going to say it. He reeks of privilege. And I thought, oh, you guys were listening. And before, I think they would have been so impressed by all of his accolades and perfect everything on paper, right? And so I'm really glad that we're being so much more open in considering that person as a whole, right? Because you're right, everyone has different opportunities to have like some, amazing sounding experiences, but we don't all come from that kind of a background, right? And so I certainly didn't. And so I'm so glad that we're having these honest conversations and, things are improving, but you guys are our future. So I think that's awesome what you're doing. And if there's anything I can do to support you, please call me, email me, whatever. Thanks for joining. I love that.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to see how these things change with STEP being pass-fail. I think there's talks about step 2 starting to be pass-fail. So I think that may foster a more inclusive environment and may cause additional problems as well. But I think it'll be interesting to see.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And I think it'll even the playing field in really good ways. Just looking over the chat here, somebody said the interview day is just one point of reference. What about the culture once the candidate is hired? So true. So true. That's why, I'm really lucky because my chairman is super supportive and he gives me time from every monthly staff meeting that we have for me to give an educational talk. And in doing that, I learned so much myself because there's so much I don't know. But yeah, we're constantly working on creating a culture where people from all different backgrounds can thrive, right? And so you're right. It's not just about the interview day, it's about having the culture that can foster people from all backgrounds to do well. So thanks for that question.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
I really like what you mentioned in terms of the efforts going on in your department to look at candidates more holistically.
Yes.
So I wonder if you have any guidance. One thing that I struggled with in the past is that sometimes these conversations about making the pool more diverse shift quickly towards like lowering the standards and trying to get the conversation focused on this is not lowering the standards, is maybe that the standards that we have are biased on its own. So what are the things that we're looking for in candidates reflects a certain worldview. So I find myself with, this side of me that says, or us as a group, that this is what we want in a student. Like a beautiful student, a great medical student should have this and that. But then when it comes to evaluation, we go back to these like all parameters that tend to favor some and not others, if that makes sense. And I think that the STEP is a great example because it's a policy change that is starting. So if you cannot change minds and hearts, right, you can at least change the rules so you can make it pass fail, and that will help long term.
Right.
I wonder if you have any tips on how to guide those conversations so they don't always end up like equating diversity with lowering the standards, but more like how do you make those standards be different?
Right,
I
right.
don't know if that makes sense.
Right. No, I totally hear you. And we have those conversations all the time. Every time there's recruiting season, after every like entire day devoted to interviewing everybody, we all sit down and talk about, you know, each candidate. And I think it's so true. It's like we're going by old school policies, old school metrics. And yeah, somebody said like, oh, we don't want to lower our standards. Like we have, you know, things that we have to answer to. And so bottom line, we always ask the question of, can they pass the board exam of our specialty, right? And so, yeah, and the comment is right. These standards are based on the views of white male, and they're the ones who created these standards. And hopefully somewhere down the line, those standards are going to be modernized and updated to be, gosh, more fair. But I think it's interesting because I'm grateful that my colleagues, I'm grateful that I'm not the only one who has to point out these things. Like we had a candidate who is Black, and she didn't come from Harvard, and she didn't have the perfect everything. There were a couple of exams that she failed, but like, I mean, this girl really overcame so much difficulty in her life. She lost her mother. She lost her grandfather who raised her. And those times coincided with the exact times when she really struggled in school. And I wasn't the person who had to say, listen, do you understand everything this girl went through to overcome and still be here today? And so I think you're not going to win everybody. And yes, somebody might take it as lowering your standards, but I think continued education and discussions like this would be helpful, because some of my colleagues said, look at her, she has grit, she's a fighter. I mean, I have no doubt that she can pass the board exams. She's not going to get our program in trouble because she won't be able to pass the board exam. I have total confidence that I can teach her this. And so I don't know. I don't have an answer for that, but I hope that with continued training and conversations like this, we can overcome what might be perceived as lowering standards. But I think it is true, you know, the conversations about how we need diversity. Like all of us are going to be more productive, creative, innovative when we have diverse minds and brains at the table. And so I keep like hammering that into the minds of my colleagues. And I think some people are listening, but it's a constant effort, right? And I know exactly what you're talking about. Yes, we do have that struggle.
Thank you.
Anyone else have questions or? Like I said, I think there are a lot of us who really care about DEI, and I would love to connect more with people and work together. I feel like a lot of us are working in silo, and it's kind of difficult to not feel like that sometimes. But I would love for us to connect more and to work together. I have connected with some people on an individual basis, but it's kind of like hard sometimes. Thanks for this opportunity to talk and connect with you all. I'm sharing my email. Yes. Feel free to connect with me, and I would love to support your efforts and work together.
Thank you so much, Dr. Savio. It was so nice to meet you and just hear your voice, the way you feel. You're very authentic in how you present and how you talk, and it's just refreshing and very a pleasure just to meet you. So thank you so much. Ria, did you have anything else you wanted to say to close us out?
Thank you for doing this. I did wanted to, and now I thought about this with a compliment to Dr. Savio. I met her because she reached out to my office, to the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, because she wanted to be more engaged in diversity efforts. And so you're a very good example of being proactive about the case. Sometimes like we wait there and we wait for people to, I don't know, find ways for us to get engaged, but you did it on your own. And that doesn't happen every day. So thank you for doing that. That was awesome. I got to meet you and I got to recommend you after meeting with you for this series. So thank you for being proactive and for caring about this, because it's really important for us. And I'm glad you're part of the cool group now.
Yeah, I would love to do more. So if there are any other efforts that I can get involved with, please let me know. I would love to.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for making the recommendation and bringing this together for us today. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Dr. Savio, if you have 1 second,
Yeah.
I have a quick question for you.
Yeah, sure.